Good afternoon, everyone. I think we will make a start. Thank you so much for taking the time out today to join me. I appreciate quite a lot of you have probably had a very busy day teaching and as I know so well, trying to get through this last few weeks of half term is quite a challenge, not to mention the fact that many of you might be very much wanting to get home to watch the England game today, so I will very much try and keep on top of my timekeeping. If you've not met me before, my name is Stacey. I am the Geography Sector Lead at AQA, and I'm going to take us through the whole session today for Geography. There is one thing that I do need you to be able to do for me now, which is if you are wanting to participate in the engagement today, so if you want to submit questions, if you want to engage in some of the polls that we're going to launch, I am going to need you to do one task for me, which is to, if you've got a device with you, to scan that QR code. Kirsty's also going to pop into the chat a link for you as well to join Slido. Now, if you've not used Slido before, it will essentially come up and ask you for a password code to pop in. If you put in their hashtag AQA Geography, it will take you to a platform that allows you to submit questions. We will also use this a couple of times throughout the session to essentially sense check a few things about your understanding of some of the things that we've covered. If you're in a room with your department or you're with other colleagues, as long as one of you is able to access it, that should be fine. And you will get the opportunity to submit questions there. You'll see there's a couple of them that are in there already. You can do that throughout the entire session. I will talk for about half an hour and then we will come to get the Slido up on screen and I'll be able to go through your questions. You also get the opportunity here to essentially push other people's questions to the top. So you can like them. The ones with the most likes essentially go to the top of the pile and they will be the ones that I get to first of all at the end. So that's how you can add some engagement to today, which is actually really helpful for me because there's well over 100 of you on here today. We're not able to kind of manage a huge amount of that in the chat. So I'll leave that there just for a few more minutes while I explain what we're going to do. So hopefully you've joined us today because as my heading says on here, you are wanting to engage in Assessment Reform Week. Now, this is a week that AQA have launched essentially to give you a bit of a sense check of where we are with qualification reform. There's been a huge amount of activity this week. We are right in the middle of it now, essentially to try and bring things down to a subject level. So if you've seen any of our promotional material, you will see these things that have come up. So across this week, we're essentially going to look at what this means for you as teachers, what assessment reform means in schools, and ultimately what it's going to mean for your students, okay? Just to give you a bit of an idea of what we've covered so far this week, and you may have already engaged in quite a lot of this, particularly if you are a subject leader or a senior leader within schools. So on Monday, this kind of kicked off with a general webinar looking at what it means for you, what assessment reform means on a policy scale. Yesterday, you will have seen some video podcasts which talked about what it might mean for your school. So talking to school leaders on what really matters and what really matters to you in your schools now. Today is probably the most meaningful session for the majority of you who are subject teachers or subject leaders. What does it mean for geography? And I will get to that a little bit later on and explain what we're doing to try and prepare ourselves for that. And then if you are engaging with AQA in this later on in the week, you will essentially be able to join AQA at Festival of Education if you are there over the next couple of days. And it will also give you a chance to see how we can support you. Now, I am very mindful that it's been a long time since you may have heard any update from not just awarding organisations, but from government about where we are with assessment reform. So that's the first thing I am going to try and cover with you now. So what is assessment reform, Stacey? That might be a good place to start. And I really want to kind of direct your attention to the diagram on screen. It's really a complex picture to understand what assessment and qualification reform actually means. It is essentially rewriting the new GCSEs and A-levels, but not just that, looking at the programme of study that dictates all of that teaching from Key Stage 1 to 3 as well. So we will find over the course of the next sort of, 2 to kind of 8 years, brand new national curriculum, brand new GCSEs, brand new A levels. Now, what is really important for you to understand is how that actually works. Now, there are many people who are involved in actually making that happen. Now, to give it a good example, people quite often say to me, Stacey, why are we still teaching about the European Union when we're no longer part of the European Union? Can you just remove that from your specification? I would love to do that. It's a very sensible thing to do. The reason why we can't do that is because awarding organisations do not own the subject content that comes from the Department for Education. So the Department for Education are the people who are responsible for outlining for every subject what is the required teaching. Okay, what are the things? What is the knowledge that is required for all of those particular subjects? And this only changes every time reformed qualifications come along. So at the moment, our qualifications are based on a subject content that was written in 2014. And you can type it into Google. If you look for GCSE Geography, subject level conditions or subject content criteria, you will find it, and it is authored from 2014. That tells you all of the things that at the time, that is what the Department for Education felt made good quality education for geography or for maths or for science or whatever subject it is that you teach. They do that by having advice from expert content drafters, so people within the subject community who are able to provide that level of policy recommendation. And that essentially tells you all of the geography that needs to be taught. So when you ask me questions like, why are we teaching about the European Union, Stacey? Why are we still having to have 10% maths requirements on our assessments? Why is there such a heavy focus on the United Kingdom? When you read that content criteria, you very quickly see why. And this was at the time, obviously, Michael Gove's government, and he really drove the last rounds of reform back in that period. Now we are now at a point where that content will start to be redrafted, and there will be new experts who are feeding into and recommending to the Department for Education what that should look like. And I'll get to sort of how you can get involved in that in a little while. So I want you to imagine you've got the Department for Education that own the knowledge requirements and the content. You've then got Ofqual, so the Office of Qualifications and Exam Regulations. They are our regulator. They own the assessment arrangements. So when you look at assessment objectives, our AO1, our AO2, AO3, AO4, that is dictated by Ofqual and is the same across all awarding organisations. They also control things like our fieldwork requirements when you have to submit your centre declaration forms to AQA. All of that level of an essentially regulation sits with Ofqual. So what you imagine, DFE own the content, the knowledge, Ofqual own the assessment. We then put those two things together and create our specification, our assessment structure, and our specimen materials. All of those kind of past papers, those example papers that you get provided at the launch of any qualification. And that's how we then translate that over to you. The JCQ is also on this diagram as well, the Joint Council for Qualifications. They essentially regulate how assessments are function, how our NEAs are managed, how all different aspects of that assessment are dictated and made sure that it is consistent across schools. So if we go back to that question at the beginning, Stacey, why are we still teaching about the European Union? It's not because we can't get rid of it, because we don't want to get rid of it. It's because it is based on that criteria. So what I want you to start thinking about is, okay, we're moving into a period of qualification reform. If it's the Department for Education that dictate and own that content that I'm going to teach for the next 10 years, how can I actually influence how that looks? How do I tell the Department for Education what we are seeing on the ground as an experienced teacher to really inform how that criteria develops? Now, as with anything, any sort of change in government policy, there is always a window for consultation, which I'm going to move on to now. So, education reform is underway, and it has been for quite some time. You might remember back in November 2025, we saw the outcomes of the curriculum and assessment review. Now, I want you to remember the role of that review was not necessarily to dictate policy. It was a series of recommendations that were provided to the government. So treat it like a consultation activity. So all of those outcomes were recommendations, and then the Department for Education decide of those recommendations, which are those that they're going to essentially commit to. So when you look at the outcomes from the curriculum assessment review, you should also be looking at the response that came back from the Department for Education. And as slides go on, we get a little bit more kind of into the detail about geography. So the curriculum assessment review report has been published. The Department for Education will now be drafting subject content for those subjects that are going to be essentially first in that phasing. And we, as awarding organisations, along with Ofqual, who we've just talked about, will be part of the consultation process with the Department for Education at that first point. So we will be reading drafts of content that come from the DFE. We'll be feeding back on some of our thoughts and challenges around that. And we will also be doing the same with Ofqual when it comes to those assessment arrangements as well. So there's that pre-consultation, pre-public consultation phase that will be happening now for those subjects that are in that first phase. Now, the question on everyone's mind, I'm sure you've all come to ask today, is, okay, Stacey, that's great. Where is geography sitting in there? We do not know that yet. I think we'd all like to be in a position where we would be able to share those timelines, but what I am going to do is to tell you what it will look like depending on where geography fits in those phases. We are anticipating that at some point soon before September or around September, we will get that announcement from the Department for Education, but we will see. Now, if we look at those timelines, you may have seen a version of this timeline from AQA previously. We're going to look at, okay, well, what does it mean if we're in the first phase? What does it mean if geography is not in the first phase? And we need to remember, alongside this, concurrently being drafted is the draft national curriculum. So you'll see the first national curriculum final version will be taught for the first time in September 2028, so 2 years' time. What you will anticipate is that by the time we get to some way through 2027, you will see a final published version of the national curriculum recommendations. Now, that will obviously for you matter for Key Stage 3, but it will also include Key Stage 1 to 2 as well. Now, when we look at GCSEs, best case scenario, if GCSE geography is in the first phase of reform qualifications, you'll see that their phase 1 for GCSEs first teach in September 2029, first assessment in summer 2031. Now, what that essentially means in practice is if we are in the first phase of those reforms, it will be the current year 6 students that will sit that new GCSE when they get to year 11. They will be in year 10 in the September of 2029, and they will be the first ones to sit that qualification. So every student you've got in your school right now, year 7 through to year 10, the year 11s have departed, they will all sit the current GCSE. Okay, if we're not in phase 1 and we're in that later phase, you essentially just knock that back for another year. So current year 5s or current year 6 students will be the first phase GCSE sitters. Whatever phase we end up finding ourselves in, A levels will follow. So if we're in first phase for GCSE, we will be in first phase for A level reforms as well. Now, you might be thinking, Stacey, that takes a long time. Why does that take such a long time? I want you to imagine going backwards from that end goal, okay? So if we look at first assessment in 2031, we've got to allow 2 years for you to teach it. So that takes it right back to 2029. We also need to be able to publish a final version of our specifications and assessments to allow you enough time to get to grips with it, to start to design teaching content, schemes of work, curriculum, all of those things, which takes time. So let's assume we can give you a year to do that. That takes us back to 2028. We then also need to be able to design and develop a specification, an assessment, sample assessment material that needs to be accredited by our regulator. And that can take multiple submissions to Ofqual to be able to develop. Now, within that time, it's not only us designing these things, it is concept testing them. So taking them out to teachers of our specifications, getting feedback from you, refining what it is that we are creating as we go through that process of development. So we're already thinking, okay, that might take 18 months for us to be able to do that realistically. And that takes us to pretty much the beginning of 2027, which is not that far away. And you've got all the consultation that needs to go on between the Department for Education and Ofqual and the public before we get final versions of that subject content, the knowledge requirements that the DFE own, and the assessment objectives. So really, even though it feels like a long time, it is not a long time in the kind of sphere of qualification reform. Now, one of the things that's not necessarily on here, but if I kind of flick back to this slide about consultation, anything that is published from the Department for Education and from Ofqual, you are allowed to engage with in terms of consultation. So if any of you have been involved, particularly if you're senior leaders or subject leaders, about the consultation that's gone on around Attainment 8 or the consultations that have gone on around SEND provision, it's exactly the same process. At some point, the Department for Education and Ofqual will publish their draft criteria for geography. You get a chance to read that draft and respond to it, either by giving your insights and challenging things, or by, sharing some of the things that you really like about that new criteria. And I would absolutely say, if you forget everything I say today and remember just one thing, my advice would be to make sure that you are engaging in that consultation. Have a look at what that criteria says. And if you are not happy with something that is there and you think that is impossible to teach, or I can't see how I'm going to be able to do that, design that into my curriculum, there's just too much content there, or I don't really think those requirements are going to help me to be able to do very good quality formative and summative assessments throughout those 2 years. That is what that consultation period is designed for. Now, obviously, AQA can do that. We are engaging in those consultations, as will the subject community, as will lots of other bodies and organisations, but nothing matters more than your voice in this, okay? You are the people who are teaching this and are going to teach this for the next 10 years when we get to 2029 or 2031, whatever it is, okay? You are the ones that need to be able to do that, and we need to be able to, as we're going to move on to, address some of the issues that we have with our current specifications. We can only do that if we get from the Department for Education and from Ofqual subject content and assessment arrangements that help us to make things more accessible, to reduce the volume of content, to improve the way that fieldwork is assessed. All of these things rest on that consultation period. I would see it as, I'm not very good at analogy, so sorry about this, but I would see it as laying the foundation of your house, right? If we see a house as our qualifications, our specifications, our assessments, it lives or dies by the quality of those foundations that you've got at the bottom. And that subject content criteria and those assessment objectives are that foundation, okay? And you only get one opportunity to really influence and engage them before you start building your walls, before you start putting a roof over the top of it. And that's the way to really think about it. And I'm not sure that we've necessarily really pushed that in previous qualification reforms prior to that. So, if all of those things sound to you, that the things that you want to get involved in, I know that there are plenty of other things that you've got to worry about on the day-to-day, but do look out for that announcement from the DFE. AQA will also be sharing with you when that lands and how you can get involved, and I'll move on to that a little bit towards the end of this. Now, just to sense check things a little bit, I know I can see some of you are sending in questions, which is great. Thank you to those of you that have. I'm just going to hand over to Kirsty, who is going to pop up on screen our poll. Thank you, everyone. So I want you to have a think about some of the things that I have just said. Some of that might be brand new to you. Some of that you might have already known beforehand. But I want you to reflect a little bit on, based on those things, how do you feel about what assessment reform could mean for you? We've not yet got into the geography of it, but I want you to think about the process generally as a whole and where you can get involved. Where do you sit? So let's give 10 seconds or so for you to have a look at that. I mean, I'm a fan of looking at some data, and we've got a nice bell curve there, which is absolutely perfect from an assessment point of view. That's absolutely fine. My expectation is that most people will sit somewhere in the middle. If you've had this conversation with me or with other people at awarding organisations at policy level or within the regulatory framework and system, you probably know, you have to do a lot of that, I think, to be able to sit in 4 or 5. Most people sitting in the middle, I think, probably is about where we would expect that to be. Okay. Hopefully by the end of this, when we think about the geography, you'll be able to say something that's perhaps a little bit moving us towards the 4s and 5s. Okay. I will just go back to my slides now. Thank you, Kirsty. Let's talk a bit about the curriculum and assessment review outcome. So what does this mean for geography? Okay. Any of you who have looked at any of the material that's come out from the Department for Education or from the curriculum assessment review outcomes, you will see that the highlight there for geography are mostly these 5 things. Okay, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but you get the gist. Contemporary and inclusive content, so basically updating our content requirements and making them much more inclusive and representative of the world in a better way than they are now. Really trying to front load disciplinary knowledge, so the idea of not just knowing the what of geography, but knowing the how and how we develop geographical thinking, promote engagement with inquiry, those sorts of things that sit within that disciplinary framework. Embedding climate change and sustainability in a much better way throughout the curriculum. So it's there now, but how do we actually improve the prevalence of that throughout our specifications? Reinforcing the value of fieldwork, and that's not to say that people don't value fieldwork. I think it's just to make whatever fieldwork is taking place feel more meaningful, and for progression to be much smoother from key stage 3, 4 through to 5. I don't think any of us would necessarily disagree with those things. So some of the key topics. I want to just, before we move into the actual stuff that we're going to talk about, you might be thinking, well, what are AQA doing? Now, I said right at the beginning that not a lot has been said about qualification reform since the curriculum assessment review landed in November. And what I want you to remember is, just because we're quiet doesn't mean that nothing is happening. In fact, I would treat it as the exact opposite of that, in that if there is a huge amount of confidential work that is going on that can't be shared, that is likely why you are seeing some of that quietness. And there is a huge amount of investment, particularly from me. And if any of you know me, have been to any of my training before or have been engaging with me, you will know geography AQA has been my life the last decade. And there is a huge amount of I guess, unintended consequences of some of the things that we've seen over the years that I am very keen to change as things move forward by having this influence. We are doing huge amounts of engagement at policy level with those people who are advising the Department for Education on their policy framework, engaging in the subject community, but also being able to respond to your needs as we're going through this. So, sometimes when people say no news is good news, not necessarily that, but treat the quietness as lots of confidential work that is going on in the background there. So I've got 3 key themes. I'll probably speak for another 5-6 minutes, maybe 7, about these 3 things. And these are the things that I want you to think about to generate these questions. Now, we've got lots of questions that have come in already that are generic, or perhaps some things specific about assessment, but let's focus on some of these 3 things. So we've got volume of content. We're then going to look at accessibility of assessment, and then we're going to look at progression. Okay. And I'm not going to launch a poll or anything on these. They're just questions really for you to think about, and do they generate anything that you want to ask me in the Slido? So volume of content. This was not particularly picked out in the curriculum and assessment review, but it's one of those things, that drum that we will continue to bang. I think geography is at a point where we try to be everything for everyone, don't we? We try to bring all the physical geography, bring all the human geography, talk about interconnections, do field work, engage in inquiry, also do the math skills, also do the cartographical skills, also do X, Y, and Z. Now, geography is the best thing in the world for being able to be a vehicle for All of these types of things that we want learners to know. But the consequence of that is we have huge volume of content. And even within that content volume, there's quite a lot of imbalance between physical and human geography in the way that you teach it. You've also got to think about the time and effort that goes into being able to do things like planning and delivering your field work, and then also preparing for the issue evaluation when you get to pre-release, and actually being able to develop decision-making geographers. If we are going to reduce content, something has to change in the way that we decide what geography makes it in and what geography doesn't make it in. And like I said at the beginning, that is down to whatever goes into that subject content criteria document. Okay, what is there, we have to include as part of a specification and assessment. Sometimes that's 60% of our content decided for us. Sometimes it's more than that. It could be 100% prescribed by the Department for Education if they wanted to do that. Okay. And when you look at this draft, when it comes to you, whenever it comes, that's what you should be looking at. Am I seeing a good enough reduction in content here that's going to make me feel confident that I can deliver this reasonably well over 2 years? Refresh the content so it remains contemporary and relevant, absolutely. One of the things that Curriculum Assessment Review Outcome has said is that new qualifications are going to have to last for 10 years. We've done that now, consequence of COVID and Brexit and huge changes in government over the last sort of 10 years, but we're never normally developing qualifications that last that long. All those that have been in teaching prior to 2014 will know that generally qualification reforms come by every sort of 6 to 8 years. If it's going to last for 10 years, that criteria has to represent our ability to update content as we go. And then skills. I've talked a lot about geographical skills in the last few months. Are we moving to a place where geographical skills is something different for our learners now? Do we need them to be able to use a pencil and a ruler to be able to measure distance along an OS map? Or is the point actually, can they look at an OS map, understand it enough to be able to say where you wouldn't build a housing development? Looking for floodplains, looking at the topography, looking at all of those things. Are we moving much more now? Or should we be moving much more now to a place where skills are more applied and in the context of geography, rather than just being able to fill in a bar graph? Or, not saying those things aren't important, but I want you to think about what kinds of geographies are we wanting to develop. So start thinking, what is a meaningful reduction in content for you? What needs to go in order for us to be able to achieve this? Now, I know if I asked all 162 of you, what bit of geography would you get rid of? I'd get 162 different answers. So I'm not saying this is easy, but perhaps there needs to be some hard decision making about what is the identity of geography now? Are we a STEM subject? Are we a shape subject? Do we sit firmly in the humanities? Do we still have these toes dipped in all other parts of the curriculum? And what is disciplinary and substantive knowledge for geographers? I'm sure you can all tell this has been my life for quite a long time. If we move on and think about assessment, so I know lots of you will be there today wanting to see a much more accessible assessment structure. Now, you might have opinions on tiering, you might have opinions on the way that we use command words, you might have opinions on the way that different item types appear. You might just want to see a lot less than 252 total qualification marks. I probably agree to some extent with all of those things. But one of the things that we want to be able to do is to look at the language of the way that we ask questions. Now, at the moment, because there is so much application required in our specifications, application AO3 is all about evaluating, interpreting things, reaching judgments. To be able to assess those things, we have to use questions that say, evaluate, discuss, to what extent, all of those kinds of really high level commands. And that is a challenge, having much reduced amount of 15% knowledge marks. So only 15% of those marks are going to be things like describe, explain, suggest. Can we actually change that if we look at those assessment objectives and maybe tweak them slightly or overhaul them completely? And being able to do that in a way that satisfies the knowledge requirements of geography is a real challenge. Lots of you also talked to us quite a lot about colour. Geography is very unique in the sense of that our assessments require real significant modifications for students who have visual impairments, who perhaps need things to be in a bigger font size, over bigger paper. Any of you that are HODs, who are the ones that put in those requests for access arrangements every year, will probably have felt that grow much more as time has gone on. We have done a huge amount of work in trying to reduce the reliance on colour and sight generally across our papers, introducing textures, removing colours using grayscale, not using colours that are very challenging for students who have colour vision deficiency. We need to go a longer way with that and think about, okay, we really need support around things like map conventions, OS map amendments, and actually having assessments that don't require so much modification. That idea of assessment for all means much more in geography than I think it perhaps does in other subjects. And thinking about question types, coherence, and assessment experience. When I say to my history colleagues that we don't have question stems in geography, they look at me in absolute horror. Thinking about how can we develop assessments that are not, here's a 2 marker, then a 6 marker, then a 1 marker, then another 4 marker, etc., etc. How can we make it much more coherent in order to be able to improve that experience for students? And again, this comes down dramatically to what that subject content criteria looks like and how our assessment objectives are formed, okay? Because we need to mash that together to give you reduced volume of content, to give you a more accessible assessment. I said I'd speak for 7 minutes, I've done 8, I'll try and do 1 now. And then the final point here, before I'm going to move on to your Slido questions, is around progression. Now, one of the things that I was delighted about when the curriculum assessment review took place was this idea of redeveloping Key Stage 3, followed by Key Stage 4, followed by Key Stage 5. Now, that seems like a very sensible way, doesn't it, of trying to redevelop knowledge requirements across Key Stage 1 to 5 in a way that will allow us to really focus on progression. Now, obviously, what we're seeing, and you'll see that from the timelines, is quite a lot of overlap. Now, one thing that we do know, and this has been announced by the Department for Education, is that there will be a consultation on the programme of study, so Key Stage 1 to 3, for subjects in September. So when you get back to school in September, at some point there should be an announcement from the Department for Education that gives you sight of the draft national curriculum. And that will allow you to perhaps see the direction of travel that we might see come into Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. And it's the starting point. Now, any of you who've not been through reforms before, that doesn't normally happen that way. Normally, historically, we've always started at A level and worked our way down. We're doing it the other way this time. So we may be in a better position to be able to meet that expectation of the curriculum assessment review of better progression. So strengthening the way that knowledge is designed and therefore developed from Key Stage 3 through to 4 and 5. If we're talking about making concepts like sustainability and climate change much more prevalent throughout the curriculum, that we're seeing not necessarily that repeated throughout the key stages, but repeated in a way that develops that knowledge throughout those key stages, and to obviously try and build in the sort of status of field work. So having really sensible but ambitious fieldwork expectations through Key Stage 1 to 3 that we then continue through Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. Now, I know lots of our MAT leads and our curriculum leaders who are in the process of redesigning their curriculums for Key Stage 3 will have a lot of this in their mind already. And I want you to think about the challenge that presents to you. You're going to have a new national curriculum to teach from 2028. You will then have a new GCSE to teach either from 2029 or 2030. And if any of you teach A level, will follow quite quickly after that with a new A level. And remember, you're also going to have that overlap between those students who are going to be doing old versions of the GCSE and those that are coming with new versions as well, and deciding what it means about your national curriculum. You can start a new national curriculum with Year 7, but how do you basically respond to the national curriculum needs through Year 8 and Year 9? Okay, so let's move on to some of your questions. If Kirsty can pop those up on screen. Now you're going to have to bear with me, everyone, because I've not seen these questions and I'm coming at these cold. So let's see where we get to. And just not a warning, but that's the word that's in my head. If we don't get to some of these by the time we close coming up to Q2, then we can revisit them. They will be archived and we'll be able to provide you essentially with some responses. So first question. Will the content finally be reduced? Thank Anonymous, I agree with you. How much change might we see in the specification overall? Now, very good question. Probably the question that clearly a lot of you want to have an answer to. Hopefully, one of the things that you've realised now is that that will all depend on what that new subject content criteria looks like. If we look at the 2014 criteria, the idea is that it was about 60% prescribed content, which left us with about 40% choice about what the rest of our specification included. Now, what I want you to remember is when you look at that 60%, one of the things that that didn't include was tectonic hazards. Weather hazards were in there, but not tectonic hazards. So one of the things that we have to consider where that content isn't prescribed is, do we want to create specifications that omit that bit of geography, or do we want to still include that because it is a very important piece of geography education? Now, AQA, along with all the other awarding organisations, created specifications that did include tectonic hazards, because that is a fundamentally important part of the geography curriculum that we really wanted to include in our specification. So we did. So in theory, all the stuff that you teach about tectonic hazards is additional content to what was prescribed in that criteria. Now, like I said before, the DFE might decide to 100% prescribe what's in there. So essentially we have to teach everything that is, we have to create specifications that have everything in there, and that is our spec. It is just what it is in that criteria. There might be room for us to move beyond that, but we will have to make a judgment there about the amount of content that remains. Now, one thing I'm very mindful of is that the current qualifications were not necessarily accredited to take into account the guided learning hours that are required for things like field work, for things like dealing with the issue evaluation and the pre-release, and being able to build some of that into our content requirements will give us a better idea about the content that is left. So whoever asked that question, I really do hope that the content will be reduced. But when you see that consultation launch, whenever it happens, when you see that draft criteria, I encourage you to look at it and think, does this represent a reduction in content? And if it doesn't, in your view, that's what that feedback needs to be able to show. It does require some hard decisions to be made here. I'm not saying this is an easy thing to be able to, for the DFE to be able to achieve, but it is going to be necessary. Okay, next one. Will controlled assessment return to assess fieldwork? One of the things that is become quite clear from both the curriculum assessment review and from conversations with Ofqual is that there isn't a desire to make changes to the way that assessment models are currently. So essentially, if you have an NEA already, you might keep that. If you don't have an NEA already, you are unlikely to have an NEA introduced. So I think we can probably prepare ourselves for fieldwork assessment remaining in some way in a written exam. We're hoping that things might look a bit different, i.e. that it doesn't just rely on application and skills, and maybe we can sample from across the AOs. But I don't want anyone to think that suddenly you're going to have to mark 165 controlled assessments every year. Okay, next one. What do you think will be the impacts of the complexity of language in questions in both GCSE and A-level? There's often a real challenge to understand the full meaning, how to apply knowledge, especially at A-level. These are great questions, because what it's allowing me to do is to say, when we talked earlier about the ownership of these, this will quite firmly sit in whatever the outcomes are of our engagement with Ofqual. So what those assessment objectives look like. Now, they might look very similar to the assessment objectives that we have now, where we've still got knowledge, understanding, application and skills. And if that's the case, maybe we will see some of the weightings of those things change, because If we can assess more knowledge and understanding, then we can ask more questions that use softer commands like describe, explain, suggest how, and perhaps then you won't find those questions that are quite so detailed, or they have multiple different instructions and commands that are sort of within them. A-level, the department has said very little about A-levels at the moment. If we're talking about this idea of evolution, not revolution, we're probably going to see even less of that change happen at A-level. But again, it will all depend on where we see those assessment objectives changing. Application is one of those things. I had a lot of conversations about application in the last few weeks about what it means in geography. Often we apply in order to be able to interpret, evaluate, make judgments, etc., etc. It doesn't work that way in a lot of other subjects. Surprise, surprise, geography is very unique. I'm sure we can all attest to that. But again, keep an eye on the consultations that come out from Ofqual. Have a look at those assessment objectives. If what you see is, right, we're finally moving towards a model where we're having much more emphasis on knowledge and understanding, that will likely lead to us being able to ask more questions that use those lower order commands and therefore reduce complexity of language. The one thing that will never change, just on that, is geographical terminology. When people throw things into reading age calculators and things like that, it often says you have to be 25 in order to be able to access this question. The one thing that will never really change is the need for geographical understanding of keywords. So that's something to always bear in mind. That is not necessarily going to change, but what might hopefully change is what we see in terms of those commands. Okay, I've got 4 minutes left. Let's see where we go. In which part of the consultation would we be able to make comments on something like pre-release? Excellent question. Thank you, whoever said that. So I want you to think about this in stages, right? Okay, so we start with the knowledge requirements, and that subject content